This guy was the most powerful healer on the entire continent during the final battle. Against the Calamity, none of the hunters were strong enough to take down the dragons. But they had sheer willpower, and with Will around, nobody ever died on the battlefield. It didn't matter how gruesome the wounds were. But that turned out to be a curse. His allies grew sick of being unable to die, being dragged back from the brink, fixed up from scratch, and thrown right back into the meat grinder again and again, was worse than just falling in combat. So they turned on the only man keeping them alive. The general drove a sword straight into Will's shoulder, and he told him, "Now you know what it's like to suffer." That was the end, and the will to fight was gone. The army crumbled. The dragons didn't let a soul escape, and Will learned that even the greatest healer in the world doesn't make it out of a dragon's stomach alive. But you think that's the end. Will wakes up 5 years in the past with every memory of the apocalypse still burned into his mind. He knows exactly what's coming, and this time he's done staying in the back line just to patch people up. He is going to learn how to fight, get into the offensive magic academy, and stop relying on everyone else to protect the people who actually matter to him, until he spots the letter sitting on the table. The application form. If that was there, it meant he really had traveled back in time. Will pushes open the door and faces the outside world, year 416 of the Solsario calendar. 1 week before the enrollment date for the High League Academy 5 years ago. He'd thought the dragon had claimed his life. He doesn't know how it happened. But if his final wish was actually granted, then he knows exactly what he has to do. He's going to enroll at Schwartz, the Offensive Magic Academy. It was common knowledge that healers couldn't cast offensive magic. Will was determined to shatter that misconception once and for all. There would be obstacles, and plenty of them. But he carried the memories of his past life and all the healing magic he had mastered there. If he gave it everything he had, he could rewrite the future. This time he would fight with his own 2 hands. Schwartz was the best school in the world for mastering combat magic. Rumor had it their elite system could turn any mage into a frontline soldier. Someone he'd met in his past life was a graduate too, but the academy's techniques were kept top secret only. The students had access to them. There was probably no precedent for a healer enrolling at Schwartz. So the real question was how to pull it off. In the end, it might just come down to money. Because of the school's reputation, nobles poured a fortune into it. If only he had managed to keep the wealth from his past life, but no. Still, the rewards he earned as a healer were generous. The real issue was time. Even if he started working now, he wouldn't make enough. By the registration deadline, a voice calls his name. Will recognizes it instantly. His sister. He'd returned to the past, and she was still alive. She asks if his stomach is hurting. Will shakes his head, claiming some dust got in his eyes. She laughs and wishes him a good day. Will realizes that in this timeline, he can stop the tragedy that would destroy her later. His healing magic would be more than enough. He can save the people he couldn't protect before. He mentions he found something, and his sister wants to know what's going on. The Magic Academy Alliance was the organization that brought together all the academies in the kingdom, calling all the shots regarding magical education. At that time, the president of the alliance was also the principal of the Schwartz Academy. But there was a period he had practically vanished from every meeting. That same day, at the director's place, he stood right beside a bed. His little girl lay unconscious, drenched in a cold sweat. He rested his hand on her face and whispered, "Marie." He muttered that the healer they brought in today wasn't good enough either, but he swore he would find someone capable of saving her. He begged her to hold on just a little longer. That was the only reason the chairman kept disappearing. He was completely consumed with caring for his sick daughter. In the previous timeline, the healing magic of that era couldn't save her, and she had passed away. Suddenly, someone climbed in through the window and asked if the director was ready to let him take over this task. The director recognized the boy instantly. It was Will, the scholarship student whose talent for healing magic was well known throughout the Alliance, though he never expected him to be the type to break in through windows. Will scratched the back of his head and chuckled. He thought that his past self would never have pulled a stunt like that, but having lost a life, maybe it had made him a bit more daring. Regardless, there was no time to waste, not for him, and definitely not for the girl. He insisted he could heal her. The director demanded to know his motives. Will told him they could discuss that later. He just needed permission to treat his daughter first. The illness was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. They locked eyes for a few tense seconds. Then the director finally relented, telling Will to show him what he could do. Will sat down on the edge of the bed and stared ahead, feeling the pressure. He thought that the head of an offensive magic academy naturally possessed that kind of intimidating aura, the type of guy who would end you on the spot if you made one wrong move. Despite that, he took a deep breath. He held her hand and began to channel his healing magic. His mana capacity had dropped significantly when he returned to the past, but the formulas were still burned into his memory. The cure for Zora's disease wasn't supposed to be discovered for another 2 years, yet he already knew it. The young girl's eyes fluttered open. Will let out a long sigh of relief and smiled, saying, "Thank God it worked." He told her she was completely drained and needed to rest. She turned away slightly embarrassed and agreed. The director asked if Marie was truly all right. She confirmed it. She said she couldn't remember the last time she felt so light. The old man nearly broke down in tears right there. He told her he understood. He understood completely, and it was such a massive relief. In another room, the director thanked Will. He said that if there was anything he could do for him, he only had to ask. Will thanked him and said the request wasn't difficult at all. As the director had just seen, his healing magic was top tier. There was nothing left for him to learn in that field. That was exactly why he wanted to enroll in the Schwartz Academy. The director asked if Will really wanted to throw a talent like his into an offensive magic academy instead of focusing on healing, and if he understood the implications. Will stood firm. The director studied the boy's eyes for a moment, then declared that his authority existed, precisely for days like this, and that he would handle everything. He shook Will's hand. In another room, a man remarked that this old fox, when you least expect it, always does something so reckless. He wondered if Will could even keep up with the Schwartz curriculum, a soft healer like him. On the day of the entrance ceremony, the director delivered a speech to everyone. The Schwartz Academy was a boarding school specializing in offensive magic, with a unique curriculum and massive grounds, including numerous training fields. With state-of-the-art research facilities and a massive library, this place boasts influential alumni and enjoys the direct backing of the kingdom. There is simply no better institution for mastering offensive magic. No healer had ever enrolled here before. The headmaster is certain that Will is in for a world of trouble. But if he can make it through this academy, he'll become a true mage. Will reflects on his past here. This is the place where he will rewrite his destiny. After classes and orientation begin, Will hits his first roadblock. A professor orders him to start. Will steps up, conjures a flicker of fire in his palm, and fires it. But all that comes out is a pathetic puff of smoke. The professor calls it yet another failure. He declares that he won't let Will attend his lectures, not until he can actually hit a target with basic offensive magic, and tells him to go practice at the training grounds behind the school. Will apologizes and asks if the professor could at least teach him how to do it. There's no way to practice something he doesn't even know. The professor retorts that wasting time teaching a healer is pointless. Will asks if he could at least study the theory in the library, but the professor shuts him down immediately. There aren't any books for healers. Just then a blonde student blasts a spell at him without any warning, slamming him hard into the ground. The guy laughs, mocking him for not even being able to dodge a basic attack. This is an academy for offensive magic. There's no room for weaklings who don't know how to protect themselves. In other words, getting hit was his own fault. The professor agrees with the student. He tells Will he should ask the Healers Academy to take him back. The blonde kid finishes with a smug grin. At least over there, he'd find people soft enough to coddle him. Will stands up, his face burning with cold hatred. Later on, sitting alone on a bench outside, Will faces the hard truth. There is no progress being made with his offensive magic. He knew it wouldn't be a walk in the park. Healing magic and offensive magic draw from completely different sources. Mages convert their mana, using spell formulas to tap into that power, and the type of mana dictates what they can achieve. Dynamic mana produces fire, explosions, and pure destruction. Healers possess only static mana, but Schwartz had a legendary reputation for forging high-level battle mages out of almost nothing. There had to be a secret method here. If he could learn to convert static mana into dynamic mana, he was convinced he could master the rest. The problem was that he couldn't even get near the classes. Both the faculty and the students looked down on healers with absolute contempt. Still, he couldn't just give up. The person he admired started with very little mana and perfected everything right here at Schwartz. Coming here wasn't a mistake. Fumbling around in the dark won't get him anywhere either. He didn't have permission to enter the library, but maybe it's worth trying to sneak in. A voice cuts through the silence, demanding to know what he's doing out at this hour. Will reflexively apologizes, then recognizes the person standing before him. She steps closer, looking down at him. He looks up, and their eyes lock. It was Lady Veronica. He felt the crushing weight of their history from his past life. They had fought together on the same battlefield. She was a top-tier battle mage, and in the final moments, they were together. Her magic blade could slice through anything in a heartbeat. And now in this life, he's been given a second chance to see her again. That's when it hits him. With her sword drawn, Veronica locked eyes with him, stating flatly that she'd spotted a student lurking nearby. She made it clear that staying on guard was only natural, demanding to know if he was up to something or plotting in the shadows, or perhaps if he was just eager to learn. Will sized up the situation in a heartbeat. Veronica was leagues ahead of him. If she decided to strike, he'd be finished before he could even blink. He kept his cool, claiming he was just being eager. She sheathed her blade, accepting his answer, but then she confirmed his name and asked if he realized who he was talking to. Specifically, that he was addressing a professor. Will was stunned. In his past life, the gap between them hadn't been that. Veronica explained that she'd skipped a few grades and fast-tracked her way to becoming a professor. It made perfect sense given her raw talent, and that was exactly when Will saw his chance. He seized the moment and asked if he could audit her classes. When he inquired about the enrollment process, Veronica shrugged, admitting she didn't even have her own class, yet she'd skipped so much schooling. She barely attended the standard lectures, and that year she was only serving as a teaching assistant, tasked with handling student inquiries, basically answering all their questions. The idea was that since they were close in age, students would feel more comfortable opening up to her. But for some reason, she couldn't figure out why, but not a single soul ever came to ask her anything. Perfect. Will cut straight to the chase. If a healer wanted to master offensive magic, what did she think he should do? Veronica paused. She'd noticed something strange about his mana flow. So he was the mysterious newcomer everyone was buzzing about. A healer dabbling in offensive magic was unheard of, but if there was any way to manipulate dynamic mana, she could certainly teach him. Will was floored, but Veronica pressed on without missing a beat. Even then, using real offensive magic would be impossible for him. He possessed far too much static mana. Even if he managed to forge dynamic mana, it would just dissolve into the static. And even with alternative methods, the formula wouldn't hold. Will asked point blank if there was truly no way at all for a healer to wield offensive magic. Veronica simply said no. He took the news hard. His plan had hit a brick wall, but giving up wasn't in his nature. If the method didn't exist, he'd just have to invent it himself. He thanked Veronica, telling her he'd think it over on his own. But she cut him off. She wasn't done yet. It was true that healers couldn't naturally cast offensive spells, but there was still a path for a healer to become a combat mage. Will was confused, so Veronica gestured to the sword at her hip. Just swing it. Do that, and you can take down an enemy. Then she pointed to the wooden chair next to her. It was made for sitting, but if someone picked it up and hurled it at another person, it would easily knock them down. People don't think to use chairs as weapons because that's not what they were designed for. The utility of an object depends entirely on the hand that holds it, and the same goes for his own power. She offered him a light tap, catching Will completely off guard. Then Veronica flicked his forehead and told him she could hurt him just as easily that way. In short, it all comes down to application. Anything can become a weapon depending on how you use it. Will got the message instantly. She was talking about using healing magic as an offensive tool. Veronica nodded in confirmation. He couldn't wrap his head around why he'd never thought of that before. He hadn't even considered the possibility. Veronica explained that this narrow-mindedness was exactly what defined people's limitations. That was why combat mages had zero interest in healing, and healers had no desire to fight. But he was different. The simple fact that he'd enrolled in an offensive magic academy already labeled him an anomaly. And in truth, his mana wasn't that of a typical healer. Will wondered if his past life's regression had blinded him to the obvious. Veronica told him to own it, to embrace that raw, aggressive fury burning inside him if he dared. Maybe, just maybe, his healing magic could actually crush his enemies on the training grounds tomorrow. Will couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Her comparison was weird, sure, but it hit him like a lightning bolt. Total clarity. He couldn't help but wonder, why didn't she flinch at the idea of a healer using offensive magic? And honestly, it was suspicious how she already had a theory ready to go. Before he could dwell on it, the instructor cut his thoughts short, noting that the class had an odd number of students. That meant Will was getting dragged into today's sparring match. The fact that he couldn't use offensive magic was his own funeral. Even if he was about to get absolutely pummeled, he'd have to live with the consequences, and the matchups were already locked in. Will was up against Ulpis. The setup was painfully obvious. Ulpis Omen came from a big-name noble family, and was always surrounded by a pack of sycophants. But from what Will had seen in class, Ulpis wasn't just talk. He was a legit battle mage. Ulpis jeered, shouting that healing magic wouldn't save him from humiliation, and that Will would be running home crying once he got his teeth kicked in. Will found his attitude genuinely grating in a way he didn't expect. Usually he'd just brush it off, but this guy was really getting under his skin. Besides, he wanted to put Veronica's theory to the test, and maybe, just maybe, get a little payback. He stepped up formally and told Ulpis that he wasn't accepting any forfeits. Will shot back, making it clear he had no intention of backing down. But he did have a proposal. If he lost this fight, he'd admit he had zero talent for offensive magic and drop out of the academy for good. The instructor called it a foolish gamble. Will kept going. If he won, he wanted permission to take the regular classes. The instructor scoffed, asking what kind of insanity this was. Ulpis barked that a loser like him was just chasing impossible daydreams. Will thought if he had to face his fear, then if there was nothing left to break, then there would be no satisfaction in the fight at all. The instructor shut down the debate. Impossible hypotheticals are a waste of time, he said. Both of them took their stances. He raised his hand and signaled the match to begin. Ulpis locked in summoning a swarm of daggers around him. He screamed at Will to witness his creation magic. Out of thin air, Countess swords materialized, primed to strike down a pathetic failure, who couldn't even cast basic offensive spells. Will centered himself. In a heartbeat, he channeled his healing magic, his eyes snapping open with razor-sharp focus, and he started dancing through the blades. Ulpis was stunned. Will analyzed the flow as he moved. The true essence of his healing magic wasn't just mending wounds. It was manipulating life itself, controlling biological activity, and pushing the body's natural healing power into overdrive. But healing wasn't the only thing he could tweak. If he twisted this into an offensive application, Ulpis kept screaming at him to stop acting special just because he got a lucky break. Will activated physical reinforcement. He snatched one of the blades right out of the air, and with one fluid motion, swiped them all away. They hung in the air for a second before clattering to the ground in a deafening crash. Exactly what I needed. He held the dagger in front of him, telling Ulpis he'd be borrowing this. He was ready to throw down. The crowd had absolutely no idea what they had just witnessed. Someone shouted, "Is that offensive magic?" Will knew it wasn't. It was healing magic, weaponized. Apparently nobody else could tell the difference. But Ulpis wasn't having it. He yelled that Will was joking, claiming he could summon way more blades than that. A battle mage couldn't possibly lose to a measly healer. Will surged forward, batting away every blade thrown his way. Ulpis was losing his mind. It wasn't about the sheer number. He declared he would grow the swords to massive sizes. He wanted to see how Will liked that. Will parried with the stolen dagger. Ulpis shrieked in disbelief and poured even more power into it. He added rotation to the blades and threw everything he had at him. Will figured it was time to dial up the physical reinforcement a notch higher. He blocked the strike. Ulpis screamed that it was impossible. "I'll heal properly later." Will glared at him. "Forgive me," he said, shifting the dagger. A wall of sand shot up between them. Backing off, caught completely off guard. The professor stepped in. The sand was his. He told them there were still other matches to settle and ordered both of them to stand down. Will stared coldly at Opus on the ground and demanded to know if he could finally join the regular classes next time. Opus gritted his teeth and told him to do whatever he wanted. Will thanked him. As he walked away, he reflected on what he'd just felt. It was his version of offensive magic, and it had worked better than he ever imagined. To think he'd actually bested a gifted battle mage his own age, all thanks to Professor Veronica. There was a path for a healer to become a battle mage. He could actually do this. He looked up at the academy flag. Opus whispered to the professor that what happened was just a little accident during class, and that it could turn into a real problem. He hinted that he really didn't want to have to report every single detail to his father, and that the professor should understand exactly what that meant. The professor agreed. There was no room for a healer, acting this arrogant around here. Back in class, Will thought he could finally settle into his lessons. He was going to learn everything there was to know about offensive magic. The professor walked in, gave Will a brief, cold look, and turned to face the room. He announced that the lesson would be on crafting magic tools. They were going to assemble ice bombs. He handed out the materials, instructing them to follow the steps while infusing their mana. It felt familiar to the Academy for healers. They had a similar course back home, but there he only ever crafted potions and recovery items. It made sense that here he'd be making weapons. The teacher probably expected everyone to infuse dynamic mana, but for crafting magic tools, the nature of the mana didn't matter as much. It relied mostly on the materials themselves. He should be able to handle this course without any trouble. He started adding the flamboyant branch powder to the ice golem fragment, and suddenly the mana stone started glowing in a strange way. Will threw it, adding a physical boost. The explosion rocked the back of the room. Will was left sprawled on the floor, surrounded by ice shards, staring at the ceiling like a total idiot. The professor was on him in an instant. He demanded to know what Will thought he was doing. Will explained that the stone had activated before he even finished infusing his mana, but the professor wasn't interested in excuses. He started deducting points from his grade. Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Ulpis was laughing just like everyone else, staring at Will with that twisted expression. Will glared right back. The next class was on magical creatures. A salamander was standing right in front of him. The professor warned that students with low grades had better sit in the front row and pay close attention. Will had barely processed how close he was to the beast when the salamander spat fire at him. He blocked it with a pot. The professor asked why on earth he was holding a cauldron. Will replied that it was necessary. The cauldron was immediately confiscated. So that's how they want to play it, Will thought. They'd let him attend classes, but they had no intention of letting him learn a single thing. A girl watched him from a distance, with a look of genuine concern. The harassment didn't stop there. The professor kept calling on Will to answer impossible questions about the materials. Someone had snitched to the instructor, claiming Will had been acting up, even though he'd never stepped a foot out of line in class. As a result, he was denied dinner. Back at the dorm, Will lay on his bed staring blankly at the ceiling. The wind in this academy was turning against him, and it was absolutely relentless. There was still a mountain of obstacles to clear, but he was making real progress. He couldn't let this petty bullying stop him in his tracks. Besides, he'd just fought with his own two hands for the first time, and actually won. He really could become a battle mage. He'd even managed to get his hands on a textbook. He needed to review the day's material. The next morning, Will walked into the classroom only to find it completely empty. It was already time for class, but the professor was nowhere to be seen. The only other person there was that girl from before. It looked like the class had been moved to a different room, and not a single soul bothered to tell them. Will walked over and apologized, asking if she thought the classroom had been relocated. She agreed, suspecting the same thing, then added that since she was the only one stuck there with him, maybe the students, the professor, and everyone else just hated his guts. She figured that was exactly it. "I guess we're on the same side," she muttered. Outcasts tend to stick together. Will thought the comment was a bit harsh, but her tone was so grim it sounded painfully sincere. Regardless, he was happy to make a friend. He told her it was a pleasure to meet her. She replied that the pleasure was all hers. Her name was Erica Glenn. Will told her she was his first friend at the academy. Erica shot back that in that case, it was pretty much inevitable. He barely ever showed up for class, and on top of that, he was a healer. Everyone kept saying that healers were nothing but weaklings. She herself attended every single lecture and was a battle mage, but even she didn't have any friends. Will molded over. Putting her personality aside, the discrimination against healers was deeply rooted. In his past life, he'd been recognized so quickly that he never had to deal with this kind of nonsense. But at an academy obsessed with offensive magic, the prejudice was thick, and studying there meant he had to fight against those biases every step of the way. Erica sighed and asked why he even came to Schwartz. Will said that just because he was born a healer didn't mean he had to stay out of the fight. Erica looked stunned. He told her he had his own reasons and asked why she had come. Erica explained that she came from a small, noble family out in the countryside. No boys had been born, and her parents were terrified that the family bloodline was going to die out. They figured if she could make a name for herself as a mage, she might be able to take over as head of the family. Will said he understood. Graduating from Schwartz would definitely make that happen. Erica admitted that she had almost no talent for offensive magic. Because of that, she couldn't make any friends. Classes were agonizing. And frankly, it was just the worst. But now she finally had a friend. As long as she had Will, who was an even bigger failure than she was, she wouldn't feel quite so insecure about her own failing grades. Will replied that things might not turn out the way she expected. Erica asked what he meant. Will said he had to find the room where the class was actually happening first. Erica decided to tag along. Will announced that they had finally arrived. The professor looked at them coldly and told them they were late. The lesson had been going on for a long time. Will apologized, explaining he had no idea the room had been changed. The professor wasn't interested in excuses. Since Will was there now, he ordered him to solve the problem on the chalkboard. Erica was outraged. They'd literally just gotten there. How were they supposed to know? And Will hadn't even had a chance to sit through the lectures yet. Will stared at the board. The professor warned him that if he got it right, he'd let it slide. But if he got it wrong, he'd lose points. He scoffed, saying, at this rate, Will would be washed out in no time. Despite the threat, Will picked up the chalk. He started scribbling away. The entire class watched him in complete silence. Some were already waiting for him to crash and burn. But Will, completely unfazed, turned to the professor with the intricate magic circle finished on the board and asked for his take on it. The professor was floored. It was flawless. He told Will to take his seat, and Opus let out a gasp of pure shock. Erica couldn't wrap her head around how he'd pulled that off. Will drifted back to his desk with a calm smile and picked up right where the lesson left off. After class, Erica sprinted after, him dying to know how he'd cracked the problem. Will explained that it looked intimidating, but it was just a practical application of the examples from the textbook he'd been studying beforehand. Erica asked if he'd really gone through that manual all by himself. Will confirmed he'd read it just the night before. The Schwartz textbook was top tier. It covered everything from the basics to advanced maneuvers. No fluff, exactly what you'd expect from the elite magic academy. You just had to put in the time to read it. On top of that, he'd always had a knack for theory, and the logical mindset he carried over from his past life gave him a massive edge when it came to grasping offensive magic. He ended up staying up late, but it was actually fun. Erica's jaw hit the floor. The material was way too dense to master without a teacher, and she'd pegged Will as the weakest kid in the room. If he was at this level, where did that put her? She begged him not to leave her in the dust. Will rested a hand on her shoulder and told her it was going to be just fine. He'd teach her anything she didn't get. They were close, after all. Erica thanked him. Will told himself he hadn't come to Schwartz to make friends, but having Erica around opened up some doors. So he told her he needed a favor in return. The classes weren't just about theory. The next one was general offensive magic, which was exactly why he'd flunked out and been barred from every other course. He used to be good at it, and now he'd even taken down Opus, but general offensive magic was still completely out of his reach. He had a plan, and he needed her help. He broke down the difference. General offensive magic relied on formulas that were already analyzed and structured accessible to anyone who put in the work. On the flip side, unique magic was forged deep within the user and only worked for that one specific person. Schwartz had separate tracks for unique magic users. There wasn't just one right answer there. He knew he could handle it using his offensive healing magic, but for general offensive magic, if you couldn't cast the actual spell, you weren't passing. The professor made that crystal clear. Will might have aced the written exam, but the practical side was a whole different beast. If he couldn't fire off an offensive spell, he was done for. The task was simple. Hit the target with a fireball, the most basic spell in the book. Without it, he could kiss his graduation goodbye. The professor suspected Will had just used some healing trick during that practice duel, and the whole idea of improved movement after healing sounded like a convenient excuse. But general offensive magic was a completely different animal. Someone as hopeless as him should just pack it up and drop the class. That's when the professor froze. Will was wearing a grin, and flames were dancing in the palm of his hand. A flicker of satisfaction washed over Will. The professor hadn't seen this part yesterday when he was with Erica. Will had asked her to help him conjure a fireball, using general offensive magic by channeling it through a salamander's tail and pressing the tail against his own palm, while using healing magic to keep it from burning him. Erica wanted to know if that was even possible for a healer, and who the hell Will even was. A split second before casting, Will used his healing magic to trigger the flame charge stored inside the salamander's tail. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfect fireball had materialized right in the palm of his hand. The projectile shot straight and scorched the training dummy. Will turned to the professor. With a calm smile, the professor looked him over for a moment and asked what he thought about it. That was definitely the flair of a standard spell. The kid might have actually learned it. Will was on his way, and he could easily get back on track. Erica's jaw hit the floor, and Ulpise ground his teeth in pure frustration. Later in class, Ulpise didn't mince words. What the hell is going on here? The professor just shrugged, saying he'd like to know that too. But Ulpise wasn't looking for excuses. A mere healer had dared to challenge him. There was no way he was going to tolerate sharing a class with that guy. If he had to, he'd go straight to his old man, and that would be the end of the entire course. The professor tried to talk him down, saying that was a bit extreme, but Ulpise cut him off. Use whatever means necessary. Just get that guy out of my sight. Ulpise stormed off. The professor stood alone in the room, deep in thought. Trying to pull strings outside of the curriculum was a risky play if he got caught. It wasn't the same as some spoiled rich kid throwing his weight around. But sometimes you have to take risks to protect your own position. A low-level healer, acting like he owned the place, and they still had no idea what the other professors were up to. He wasn't about to let this kid ruin his life. He'd have to deal with him personally after school at the training grounds. The professor got straight to work. He figured Will was feeling pretty full of himself, and that wasn't a compliment. The kid had missed several classes since enrollment started. How do you plan on making up for that? Will thought about telling him the absences were the professor's own fault, but decided it wasn't worth the trouble. He explained that he'd asked a classmate for the missed material and studied it all on his own. There hasn't been any issue at all. The professor didn't budge. For missed time, extra lessons are mandatory, and the content is decided by the supervising instructor. You'll be in a mock battle against me personally. Will took a second to let that sink in. A teacher fighting a student. The professor added that he'd give him a handicap considering the massive skill gap. Just one clean hit would count as a pass. Since he was being so generous, there was no reason to run. What the professor didn't say out loud was what he was planning to do with his magic. The boy's attacks wouldn't even come close. All he had to do was beat him until he understood the real difference in power. Then maybe he'd listen to what he had to say. Will agreed. I'll do it. The professor smirked and activated his magic. Will had seen this spell before. It was the same one that tore up the ground. He dodged in a flash, but another strike came down from above. He ducked, and the next one surged up from beneath him. The professor sneered, asking if running was all he knew how to do. Will steadied himself, analyzing the situation. Unlike creation-style magic, this style manipulated the existing ground itself. That's why it was so fast, and the angles of attack were endless. But it wasn't unbeatable. He leaped, dodging the strikes, and pushed forward. The professor slammed another magic circle into the ground, raising walls on either side of Will to trap him. He grinned. Will used the walls as leverage, vaulted over them, and closed the distance with his weapon drawn. But just as he got close enough to land a strike, the professor turned into stone. Will barely scrambled away from the spikes. The professor scoffed, calling the boy weak. He couldn't even break through his absolute form with that measly level of power. He'd never heard of a healer using healing magic to fight, but it was just a cheap imitation. Trying to be a battle mage with such pathetic magic was almost laughable. Will replied calmly, thanks to his healing magic. He'd studied the human body in depth and learned that humans usually live their lives by subconsciously holding back their own strength. The reason is simple. The body can't withstand its own raw power. If someone tried to exert force beyond that limit, their own body would shatter, the professor retorted, with total disdain. Will was just trying to lecture him because he couldn't compete with offensive magic. Will calmly replied that regardless, even if he removed the limiter to unleash more power, his body would still end up damaged. But he was a healer. It didn't matter if his arm broke. The professor was caught completely off guard. Will stepped closer with a smirk, saying he hated pain, but he could just heal himself on the spot. So let's put it to the test right now. He lunged with everything he had. The blow landed clean, and the professor's glasses went flying through the air. Will declared that it wasn't wise to arbitrarily decide the limits and potential of a student. He'd learned that when Professor Veronica suggested using healing magic for offense, that there's nothing more foolish than labeling something impossible. He could get much stronger, but before he could even finish his sentence, Will spun around abruptly and dodged a strike from the professor. They stood face to face. The professor held his own glasses, looking visibly furious. Will remarked that he thought the professor would approve if he landed just one hit. The professor told him to shut up, with no witnesses around admitting he'd been punched by a healer. It was something he couldn't accept, and he launched a volley of stone projectiles. Will pointed out that releasing the limiter wasn't just for close-quarters combat. He dug his heel into the ground and shot toward the professor at an absurd speed. The professor barely had time to react. The stone wall didn't rise fast enough. He squeezed his eyes shut, then glanced to the side, trying to see if the movement had stopped. But he couldn't move a muscle. The strikes kept coming, and time seemed to crawl to a standstill around him. He silently begged Will to stop. The pain was excruciating, far worse than being hit at normal speed. He couldn't escape, or even scream. He just silently prayed for it to end. Then he was tossed aside. His body slammed violently against the floor. Will walked up and said that for him, it only lasted a split second. The professor, still on the ground, demanded Will explain what he'd done. Will replied that, unlike the professor, he could explain it perfectly. The exact moment the punch connected. He had activated a sensory enhancement on himself. Originally, a healing spell for people whose vision and hearing were deteriorating. By cranking his reaction speed to an extreme level, his senses became insanely sharp, making 1 second feel like dozens of distinct moments. He'd wanted to know how much it hurt to take a hit in that state, then asked if he'd passed the lesson. The professor nodded yes. Will added one more thing. He knew it would be hard to shed such deeply rooted prejudices. But if the professor kept pushing him, he'd make sure the man learned exactly what kind of pain his own body was capable of feeling. All he wanted was to attend class, without being bothered by the other students. Could the professor guarantee that? Later, in the hallways of Schwartz Academy, the professor walked alone, still trying to process what had just happened. He had always believed healers were weak, incapable of combat, meant only to serve the offensive mages. But Will was different. He didn't just have combat skills. He possessed a genuine intent to kill. Opus appeared and asked if the lesson was over. Noticing Will was on the verge of being expelled, the professor told him to be quiet and stop messing with Will. Treating him like a mere healer was a mistake that Opus couldn't afford to make. Opus said that wasn't what he wanted to hear, and reminded him that if he told his father everything, the professor knew exactly what would happen. The professor told him to go ahead and do it, then paused to think for a second. Then he added that if Ules actually took this to his father, it was highly likely that he'd be the one getting expelled, not Will. Instead of the Omen family making their move as planned, it looked like Will would be the one sharpening his claws from now on. Ulpis stood alone in the hallway, slamming his fist against the wall in pure frustration, cursing the trap that was slowly tightening around him. A few days later in class, Will let out a yawn. Things had been pretty peaceful. The professor had clearly spoken to Ulpis because he'd glare at Will from time to time, but he never actually did anything. That gave Will the space to focus on his training. Even if it wasn't enough to change the fate of humanity just yet, he knew he had to become so much stronger. The idea of using healing magic to boost his physical stats was solid, but in reality, all he was doing was throwing punches and kicks with brute force. His sensory boost worked fine for intimidation, but compared to the sheer versatility of a real battle mage, he still had a long way to go. He really needed to come up with some new techniques. He called out to Veronica. She said she had something to tell him first, and Will asked what it was. The professor said he'd done well. It had become a major topic among the faculty, a healer actually doing this. Keeping up with the curriculum at Schwartz was a huge achievement, even if most of the other teachers seemed pretty annoyed by it. Will figured he could have guessed that, and he asked if she was hiding the fact that she was the one who mentored him. Veronica said she wasn't hiding it at all. She just hadn't found the right moment to mention it to the other professors yet. Will realized she was a bit of an outcast among her own colleagues despite her status. He told her that was a huge relief. Everything he'd achieved was thanks to her guidance, and he would have felt terrible if his actions had landed her in hot water. Veronica replied that it didn't bother her, so there was no need to worry. Besides, she was actually grateful. Like she'd said before, because of the very nature of healing spirits, none of them would ever think to put this theory into practice. Then she drew her sword, saying she was curious to see what a combat healer actually looked like in action. Will asked what she was doing. Veronica replied that she wanted to assess his current level, since he was looking for advice on how to get stronger. Will said fighting her felt a bit much, but she countered that there was no mercy on the battlefield and lunged at him. Will was caught off guard and scrambled back, but managed to block the strike with a dagger. Veronica's raw strength began to overwhelm him. She kept pressing forward with strike after strike, and even with his reaction speed boosted by magic, Will could barely keep up. It was obvious this wasn't just about speed. Her movements were refined, calculated to unleash a relentless barrage, and forcing his body to keep pace, through physical enhancement alone, had its limits. He had one trick left, a burst of speed he hadn't shown her yet. He had to catch Veronica off guard, so he channeled his strength into his foot and launched a sudden thrust. Veronica was caught by surprise, but she moved her blade with precision, deflected the strike, and neatly sliced through his weapon. Will stared in shock as the blade hit the floor, and he let out a long sigh. Veronica sheathed her sword and admitted she was impressed. She hadn't expected him to force her to use her magic sword. Will commented that she hadn't even broken a sweat. She replied that she'd assumed he was just a healer trying to fight like a battle mage, but he clearly had skills that put him in a completely different class, someone with real talent. Will thanked her, and the professor added that she loved his ambition, but he was right, pure physical effort would only take him so far. It just wasn't enough. Will realized that no matter how far he pushed his body past its limits, there was a ceiling to what he could actually achieve. Veronica countered that a sword isn't just for swinging. It can thrust. It can be shoved aside. There had to be other ways to utilize the skills he already had. Will admitted that nothing had worked so far. She pressed on, suggesting he was likely missing true, raw combat experience. He needed the intensity of a real-life battle to finally sharpen his ideas. She then asked if he hadn't noticed something during their spar just a moment ago. Will asked if he should keep training under her. Veronica replied that it wouldn't be a bad idea, but since it had already come up, there would be a joint training exercise soon. Will mulled it over. Something similar had existed in his past life, the joint training exercise between the three major academies: the Schwartz Academy of Offensive Magic, the High League Academy of Healing, and the Silvernay Academy of Swordsmanship. Students from each school would form squads to take on actual suppression missions. He hadn't participated back when he was at High League, but in this life, he would crush those monsters and rewrite the future he knew. This would be his first real hunt. Veronica stared at him blankly for a second, then explained that to participate, he had to prove his worth in the Academy's selection exam. She had heard rumors of a student being hailed as a prodigy among the first years, that particular year. Will had to aim for the top spot, but first Will asked how the exam even worked. Veronica explained that the candidates essentially duked it out. 100 students signed up every year, and those who displayed real power were the ones who made the cut. Will committed the info to memory. It all came down to fighting. He thought few would be crazy enough to go in solo, but that kind of aggressive drive must be part of the Schwartz style. The thought brought old memories flooding back. He wondered what his old mentor was up to now. Veronica added that regardless, this so-called prodigy had already surpassed some of the instructors. Claiming the #1 spot wasn't going to be easy. Will figured the kid must be better than that specific instructor, so he asked if she hadn't met this particular student herself. Veronica replied that there was apparently a teacher involved, so no one really dared to ask any questions. Will sensed there was more to it than just that. She told him not to sweat it. She would help him train too. Will thanked her. On the day of the selection exam, Will walked in, thinking about how the day had arrived in the blink of an eye. He had prepped as much as he could. It was time. A voice called out to him. Will recognized him immediately. Headmaster Alnaram Goldgrin. Alnaram remarked that it had been a while and that his granddaughter had been doing well ever since, even though Will had saved the girl. The headmaster regretted not being able to see him afterward, and he knew that adjusting to Schwartz must have been a rough ride. Will replied that he'd had a hard time at first, but he was doing perfectly fine now. He added that he was gunning for the top spot in the exam. The headmaster laughed, calling that impressive. A voice cut through the air behind them. It was a professor, and his tone was anything but friendly. He scoffed, calling it a joke that this guy wanted the top spot. As the training supervisor, he said he'd love to teach punks like him a lesson. Will recognized him instantly. In his past life, he had crossed paths with this man, Goat, the Purple Flash, known for his offensive magic and heroic feats during the Great War. Personally, Will had zero fond memories of him. Goat went on, saying, "Combat is all about talent, and that training and effort couldn't make up for what you lack." Being a healer meant Will had no chance of winning. Will stared at him coldly. Alniram stepped in, saying the exam would start shortly, and the results would speak for themselves. There was no point in arguing about it. Goat agreed, adding that either way. The one stepping up to face Will was Sirius, a young man with long, flowing white hair. Sirius Blue Note gave the headmaster a sharp nod, then locked eyes with Will. So this was the prodigy, the rival, the one obstacle he had to crush to claim the top spot. The two of them stood there, locked in a tense stare. A spark ignited in their eyes. Elnaram noted that keeping a cool head was vital, but time was up. It was go time. Everyone headed toward the arena. The crowd was buzzing in the stands, while the participants lined up and stood ready. Will spotted Erica in the mix. He asked if she was really jumping into this. She shot back that if she didn't, her attendance for certain classes would be slashed. Ulpus glared at Will, his expression heavy with pure malice. Will just flashed a smile at Erica, who made it crystal clear she'd rather be anywhere else. But wherever else was, Elniram stepped in. He boasted about being proud to see such a massive turnout this year. He told them to let their passion and their fighting spirit lead the way. He explained that this preliminary round was a brutal survival match. Only those who stood until the end would advance to the main event. Will crunched the numbers in his head. 100 people. On a single battlefield, that's a lot. A whole lot. Elniram sensed the hesitation and told them not to sweat the numbers. Then he raised his staff. A massive, swirling portal ripped open beneath everyone's feet. The ground vanished, replaced by a deep, starry sky. The students looked around, completely lost as to what was happening. Elniram announced that they were off. Will materialized in the middle of a dense forest. He recognized the terrain. It had to be the woods behind the academy. A voice echoed nearby, asking if anyone could hear him. The teleportation had scattered them all over the place. Same deal. They needed to dodge the heavy hitters and team up with anyone they knew. The starting positions. They were pure luck. Will muttered that a spell capable of teleporting 100 people at once. Oh man, that's just insane. It's impossible to wrap your head around such power. The headmaster ignored the remark. He declared that the selection exam had officially begun. Will leaped instantly, landing silently atop a thick branch. He stifled his presence to the absolute minimum, suppressing his vitals to stay off the radar. But, just as he looked back, there were already 3 students brawling nearby. One of them barked an order at his golem to charge in. A girl rushed toward them with a magic hammer in hand. A third guy, a blonde, unleashed a blizzard that froze both of them solid. Honestly, watching closely, this was a golden opportunity to study a variety of offensive spells. It would be a total waste to just stay defensive and try to scrape by the test. Plus, there was something he wanted to test himself. The golem boy took out the other 2 and started gloating loudly, bragging about how everyone should have seen how powerful his golem was. Will appeared behind him before he could finish his sentence. He gripped the boy's head and triggered a consciousness disruption spell. The kid went down instantly. Will studied him for a split second. This technique, manipulating the flow of life to force an opponent into unconsciousness, required direct physical contact with the head. It was usually a tough move to pull off, unless you had a massive power gap. But he had neutralized him without a scratch. Professor Veronica would be thrilled. He turned and dodged a flurry of knives that sliced through the air toward him, embedding themselves in the ground all around. Will let out a weary sigh. Ulpis. Some people never learn. The noble claimed he didn't know what he was talking about, that he just wanted to pass the exam, and that he was going to use everything he had to make it happen. The 2 cronies behind Ulpis closed in together. Ulpis summoned a volley of knives with his incantations. The second one coated the blades in lethal poison. The third one mirrored the whole thing with shadows, multiplying those poisoned blades by the dozens. Ulpis. He warned that those blades would pierce skin at the slightest touch. In that sheer volume, Will's speed didn't matter. He wouldn't be able to dodge them all. The knives were launched. He calculated quickly. He could neutralize the poison with healing magic, but sustaining even minor scratches, even with physical enhancement, would be a problem. He activated a healing spell in his palm, then something lunged in front of him. The golem blocked everything, absorbing the knives like a shield. Ulpis was baffled. The golem belonged to the boy Will had already beaten. Will realized what happened. Normally, healing magic only works on living beings, but the golem ran on a mechanism fueled by the summoner's blood. He couldn't control it with precision, yet by pumping life force into it, he could steer it just enough. The golem surged toward the group. It landed a clean punch on one lackey and sat on the other. Ulpis complained that his men were taken down so easily. Will was already in front of him. He grabbed his face with one hand. Good night. Ulpis blacked out. In another part of the forest, the golem faced a water spell. Will watched from afar, satisfied. Physical enhancement limited him to close quarters combat, but the golem covered that weakness perfectly. He still had time to study the other students' spells. Then a hurricane formed in a corner of the forest. Will frowned. What was this now? The gust rushed toward them. Will leaped to dodge, and the cyclone swept the golem away. Nearby students were knocked over in one fell swoop. When Will landed, he glanced to the side. Someone was approaching. It was serious, exactly as Will had anticipated. An impressive skill, someone who wouldn't be easy to beat. Will was still wondering if it was worth testing his limits when the director's voice echoed through the air. Enough effort. The preliminaries were over, and all 4 had succeeded. The main event would take place the next day in the arena. For now, he could look after himself. The teleportation spell would activate in a few moments. Will watched his rival from a distance. Sirius did the same, holding his gaze without blinking until he vanished along with the others. Will couldn't. wait for tomorrow either. Back in his dorm, he opened his journal and jotted something down. What he could do before the main event, what he needed to consider. The night was quiet. Outside in the hallway, not so much. A few nobles were grumbling among themselves. That guy is way too strong, and he even healed everyone who got knocked out. Isn't that enough to make them give up? Ulpis told them to shut it. They came from weak families, so they didn't understand. The teachings of the Homine family were clear. Healers had no place among true mages. If anyone found out that he was held back by a healer, what would his father say? The other two exchanged a look. He said he could do whatever he wanted, but that didn't hurt them anymore, and they walked down the hall, without looking back. Ulpis stood there, anger bubbling. He didn't need magic to get rid of Will. In his room, Will was studying as usual when a knock came at the door. Too late for a normal visit. He felt something was off even before opening it. It was Ulpis. He wished him a good evening with a smile and asked if Will didn't find the moon beautiful tonight. Will cut straight to the chase. What was he up to? The noble replied that he just wanted a peaceful conversation. He said with almost relaxed honesty that he hated healers and had already done plenty to get Will expelled from the academy. Will figured he would neutralize most of it. Ulpis said he was done beating around the bush. The message was simple. Will should leave Schwartz. Will said that at least he valued honesty, but he really wanted to get to the bottom of this. Why go to such lengths to paint him as the villain? Ulpis retorted that he didn't need a reason. Treating healers like garbage? It wasn't any different in the Homine household. Anyone born as a healer was instantly shipped off to some remote branch. Ulpis's older brother was one of them. Even when people mocked him, the guy just laughed it off. An offensive mage and a pathetic healer, they were worlds apart. Will called it what it really was. Indoctrination, a mindset deeply rooted in such a prestigious family. Ulpis didn't even try to deny it. And that was exactly why Will had to get out of Schwartz. This place was no home for a healer. Will asked if Ulpis actually thought he'd just roll over and agree. Ulpis hissed that he'd make him say yes one way or another. After all, there was someone Will wanted to protect, right? The servants outside had already done their homework. Will grew up with his sister in a secluded village. He must miss her like crazy. If Ulpis gave the right orders, what would happen to her? He left the threat hanging in the air, then stepped closer and demanded to know if Will was finally convinced. Will muttered a yes. Ulpis told him to pack his bags immediately. That was the exact second he felt a hand clamp around his throat. Will slammed him back and twisted his arm into a lock that left him absolutely zero room to move. Ulpis begged him to let go. He was going to snap his arm, Will coldly said. He'd already made his choice. A sickening crack echoed Ulpis. Started gasping for air, his voice coming out in jagged fragments. If he showed up with a broken arm like this, the academy wouldn't just sit back and watch, and neither would Will's father. Will just said it was fine and instantly healed the arm. Ulpis realized what was happening and looked up, confused and relieved for a split second, until the next snap shattered the silence. Will broke it again. He said he'd fix it, and he'd snap it over and over as many times as it took until Ulpis begged him to stop. "Will you?" he asked. Will let go of his arm and spoke with chilling calm. Trying to hunt him down was one thing, but if Ulpis dared to go after his sister, he wouldn't let him off the hook ever again. So it would be best if the noble started begging from the bottom of his heart. Right now, Will was still just breaking his spirit. Ulpis stayed on the floor, trying to wrap his head around what just happened. A demon wearing a healer's face. He never should have messed with this guy. Because what's waiting ahead is something far worse than death. As the night drags on our protagonist, reminds Ulpis not to forget their little promise. Never lay a hand on him again. Will stretches out in his room, thinking that honestly, this was kind of refreshing, but now he's ready to sleep until tomorrow. A few hours later, the main event finally kicks off. Al-Narim watches everything unfold from his seat with Bode and Veronica settling in nearby. Will scans the situation and thinks about the four who made it through the qualifiers. Now they're set to face off in one-on-one duels. Even so, He still can't believe she actually made it this far. He turns around and spots Erica standing right in front of him. The girl explains she built walls of fire and used that strategy to survive without having to take anyone down head-on. Will rethinks the offensive imagery, running away from the start. No way she could have survived doing just that. Erica grins and says that since they're friends, he might want to take it easy on her. Will says no, and she retorts that she passed the qualifiers on her own merit, and now she's aiming for a top-tier rank. A professor calls the start of the battle. Erica readies a fire spell and hurls it straight at Will. He blocks it with his own arms, noting that it's just orthodox fire magic, the kind of flame he can regenerate from in his sleep. He even starts to feel a bit sorry for Erica, because all he has to do now is knock her out. But then he notices something is wrong. There was something different about the fire. Erica launches another fireball and warns him. It's not over yet. Will dodges to the side and realizes that the flames that hit him earlier still haven't gone out. It's Erica's unique magic, a fire with abnormal, persistent heat. The raw power is average, but if he keeps taking hits like this, it's going to get dangerous, even with his healing skills. When he first saw the walls of fire, he thought it was just a natural property of the salamander's gift. But no, it was Erica's influence. He finally understands how she managed to create such unbreakable barriers, and in a way, it perfectly reflects her stubborn personality. The crowd is going wild. Everyone is screaming that she's doing great, and that she's going to wipe the floor with the healer. Erica wonders for a split second if she can actually beat Will, but quickly pushes that thought aside. After all, she already passed the preliminaries. She tells him it's time to just give up. Will says he's fine and that he was actually about to counter. He heals his own hand while he's talking. Erica activates another spell, declaring it's time to end this for good. Will breaks into a grin. If the flames won't fade, he'll just use them to launch an attack. Erica watches the flames wrap around his fists. Will charges at her. The girl holds out her hands and says, "I give up." She drops to her knees. The winner is announced. Will thinks that even after winning healers, still don't get any respect. The crowd starts yelling at Erica, telling her not to quit like that if she still wants to call herself an offensive mage. Erica looks at the crowd and says they were cheering for her just a moment ago. She feels sorry for that. Will helps her up and tells her not to worry about it. He thinks she fought well and has a good chance of making it through. Her eyes light up, but Bodhi appears behind her, eavesdropping on the moment. "Come to think of it," he says, "healers are worthless. Giving up to trash only makes you worse than trash." She clearly failed, so she should just get out. Will asks if that kind of talk isn't a bit inappropriate for a teacher to say to students. Bodhi replies that he is the battlefield supervisor, and if the participants show such a pathetic level, he is already walking away as he speaks, leaving his thought unfinished. He throws over his shoulder that it seems only one person will be moving on. Sirius appears behind Will and starts talking to him. Will wonders when he even got there and thinks to himself, this guy definitely knows how to talk. He wants to know if Sirius feels the same way as Professor Bode. Sirius answers that at the end of the day, strength is everything, and that Professor Bode was right simply because he is strong. Will says he understands, but Sirius adds that he doesn't think Will is weak either, so he better be right about that. Will stares at him, suddenly recalling a very serious note from his past life. Will had heard rumors of an absurdly powerful offensive mage his own age operating up on the northern frontier. The wind he conjured wiped out everything in its path, reducing it all to nothing. And during the last match between the two of them, it was Will who took the win. Will says that judging by Professor Bode's attitude, it seems he won't be recognized unless he wins, so he's going to win. Sirius says he understands. The professor announces the start of the exam. Sirius focuses all his energy and blasts it at Will. Will dodges by diving to the side, kicks off the ground with force, and charges his opponent. Sirius stands completely still and blows him back with a gust of wind. He reaches his hand out to protect himself, thinking he's figured out the pattern, but he can't get close enough. The two of them stand there face to face. Sirius notices Will's speed and realizes it's becoming a real headache. He immediately readies another spell, unleashing a massive blast of wind. Will realizes this isn't just a simple tornado. This shockwave is powerful enough to blow everything away. If he takes this hit head-on, when he's finished, he'll be blasted right out of the arena. Time to put his plan into action. He slams his hand into the ground, and a tree erupts from the earth, shooting up in mere seconds to form a massive barricade right in front of him. Erica's eyes go wide in shock. That was healing magic too. Will had just reached a whole new level of power. Will keeps a confident smirk on his face and asks Veronica what she thinks. Veronica starts to comment on the tree, but Will cuts her off. He explains that he channeled his life force into the plants, forcing them to grow at an accelerated rate. He'd stumbled upon offensive plant magic at the library and figured he might be able to put it to use here. With this, he has a variety of tactical options, depending on the plant type. But before he can finish, his vision blurs, and he collapses right into Veronica's arms. She asks if he's okay. Will confirms he is, though he wonders if he just drained all his mana. That book didn't mention this technique would be such a heavy toll. Veronica cuts straight to the point, sharing her thoughts. Destruction is always easier than healing. Healing magic burns through mana much faster, and using it to recreate objects is likely far less efficient than just sticking to standard offensive spells. Will acknowledges that he'll have to choose his moments carefully. He never had the natural talent for pure offensive magic to make up for the power gap, but he's finally pushing past his own limits. Across the arena, Sirius raises his hand and fires, a barrage of wind blades that slice the tree in two. Will studies the pattern, watching the tornado that knocks enemies back, the shock waves that blast everything on the sides, and those wind blades designed for massive structures. Anyone who gets close gets caught in that tornado. It's a powerful, airtight defense, exactly what you'd expect from a top-tier candidate. But Will has already decided he's going to get stronger too. He lunges straight toward Sirius. Sirius scoffs, telling him that no matter how many times he tries, he'll never land a hit. Once again, Will is sent flying. Even so, a grin spreads across his face. Sirius doesn't get it until a tree root suddenly slams into his shoulder from below. Sirius has no clue what just happened. Will explains that while the tornado protects the immediate area, it doesn't guard the ground underneath. The plant sends its roots deep into the soil and sprouts up from anywhere. Sirius looks ahead, clutching his injured shoulder. Will asks if he really cares that much about Professor Bode. The two of them always seemed like an odd match. Sirius replies that Bode is powerful, and he learns from him. Will counters that he shouldn't even need that. He comes from a prestigious family. But Sirius explains that in his household, magical ability is everything. Age and gender mean nothing. Only the strongest becomes the leader, and everyone else is just a rival in the race for succession. His father never taught him any magic, Will realizes, and Sirius adds, that's exactly why he follows the professor. It's the fastest path to becoming stronger. Then he asks if they're done yet, because his shoulder is killing him. Everyone is caught off guard by the casual way he said that. Will looks up with a smile. Behind Sirius, a wind dragon begins to take shape. Sirius declares he'll finish this and launches the dragon at the protagonist. Will realizes just how dangerous this attack is. Lately, he's been thinking about how offensive mages tend to hold back during these practice matches. That's exactly why he's fighting with everything he's got. Having talent, a highborn family, or a tragic past doesn't make anyone inherently better. Everyone has something they fight for, and that is precisely why he wants to beat Sirius for real. Now Sirius asks what he's rambling about. Will says he was just thinking out loud, but now he's going to use his best seed. Vines surge forward, and the leaves unfold. In that very instant, Will summons Yggdrasil, the world tree. With everything he's put into it, growth like that should normally take ages, and forcing that kind of expansion drains way more mana than any other plant. But the more power he pours in, the more energy it channels. The tree surges toward the dragon. The dragon cleaves the tree in half and keeps charging. With a heavy sigh, he watches the chunks of wood go flying through the air. Then they start glowing under the sun. Sirius is baffled. How is it still in one piece? Will explains that this plant has insane vitality. Even a single branch can keep growing non-stop. While Sirius was conjuring the dragon, his defenses were wide open, and the World Tree didn't waste the opening. The World Tree slammed into Sirius with full force. Sirius crashed to the ground, battered. Will pointed his blade right at him. Sirius admitted defeat. The announcer roared that Will was the winner. The crowd went wild. A healer actually took down Sirius in a fair fight. Maybe the kid really is that strong. Sirius stared at the ground and sighed. Will reached out, saying, "That was a close one, exactly what you'd expect from a prodigy." Sirius shot back that it still wasn't good enough. Will didn't get it. That was one hell of a fight. Before he could say another word, Bod appeared and struck Sirius with a bolt of lightning. The boy went down even harder. Bod kicked him into the tree, then hauled him up by his arms, telling him he'd failed and that he was going to drill him harder. Once again, the crowd whispered that he was being way too harsh. Bod turned to everyone and snapped that the same went for any idiot watching. He couldn't stomach the idea of a healer taking first place. Dead silence. Will wondered if this was going too far. He was the one who won, but that didn't mean Sirius was weak. It was a great fight, and if they ever fought again, Bod cut him off. He said Will shouldn't even bother responding, or talking about good fights, or future potential. It's all nonsense. On the battlefield, strength is everything. If you lose, you're treated like trash, and you lose your life. Simple as that. Will thought about how Bod was doing this to his own student. Then he spoke up. He beat Sirius and proved his worth. Being a healer doesn't make you weak. Bod shot back that this level of strength in the past Bod, and his classmates had pinned Will against the wall. Will argued that healers don't fight, but they can support everyone with their healing magic. It was a division of labor, and without teamwork, humanity would perish. Bod stayed silent for a moment, then spoke. His students went to the front lines to buy time, while the others ran away. But those cowards were slaughtered by small monsters while they fled. The students who stayed and fought gained nothing and lost their lives, and the healers couldn't even reach the battlefield, let alone save them. For garbage like them, that was exactly why Sirius died. Bod pulled back his fist, eyes gleaming. Will admitted that Bod had a point. Being weak means you can't do a damn thing when it actually matters. But in an age where monsters are just going to get deadlier, the strong can't afford to be selfish. Will clenched his fist and said people like him who have nothing have to get strong. Then he asked point blank if he beat Professor Bod, would he finally be recognized? Bod smirked, declaring that once the match was called, all the weaklings needed to clear out. The narrator noted that Bod couldn't admit out loud that he was craving a real fight, but the young man made it clear that when it came to the selection, the rules were going to be his. The announcer looked over at Will. Will just gave a slight nod. The narrator let out a heavy sigh and declared the start of the special match. Professor Bod versus Will. Bod cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the arena. He warned Will that he was about to prove just how pathetic his skill level really was. Will knew his magic reserves were pushed to the absolute breaking point. He was staring down the most formidable opponent he had faced to date. There was no way to win this with a standard strategy. He needed to heal himself, but Bod was already closing the distance, taunting him. He sneered that Will was way too slow. A flash of violet lightning blinded Will and slammed into him with full force. Bod looked into the future, laying out the 3 reasons why his victory was inevitable. Range, distance to suppress the enemy, speed to leave them no room to react, and power to finish the fight in a single blow. With no counterplay, the battle would be over in a flash. He barely noticed Will. Annoyed that Will couldn't even hear him anymore, Will challenged him, asking where that final blow was. He was still standing. Will understood the mechanics of Bod's unique lightning magic. To minimize the damage, he had to reroute the electrical current away from his core, no matter how intense the strike was. If his brain fried, no amount of healing magic could save him. So he forced the circuit through his veins, conducting the electricity away in a split second, channeling it from his arm and grounding it through his leg. It dulled the impact significantly. He could survive this. Time to counter. Bod laughed with pure arrogance. He told Will that surviving was a miracle, but he was still a wreck. Will pushed himself to activate his physical enhancement, but his mana bottomed out the very next second, and he felt his entire body seize up. He couldn't muster even a shred of strength. Bode explained that there was an absolute rule. Anyone struck by his violet lightning is paralyzed and unable to move. Will moved anyway, muttering that this was going to be a problem. Bode just kept that smirk plastered on his face. He noted that now that he thought about it, Will was holding up surprisingly well just a moment ago. Another lightning bolt struck him. High in the stands, Erica clasped her hands, tears in her eyes. Will cursed the situation. Bode was a monster. His unique magic had no openings, and all that arrogance finally started to make sense. Still, Will forced himself back to his feet. He was locked in on winning. He declared that this was his final seed and his final spell. He unleashed his plant manipulation, screaming for the tree to grow. The water treasure tree erupted in front of him. When properly calculated, it absorbs massive amounts of moisture from the ground, acting as a living shield. It would scatter the electricity. Bode demanded to know what that was. Will looked up, just as shocked as the rest of the students. Bode simply sliced the tree in half. Will admitted he was out of options. Bode strode toward him with a mocking grin, asking if this was his last resort. Ending a fight with a defensive technique was pathetic. But then he noticed something growing along the side of the split wood mushrooms. They were blooming rapidly across the splintered surface. "What is this?" Bode whispered. Will could hardly believe the timing. Certain plants and mushrooms thrive after a lightning strike. When a forest burns, they are the first to emerge, growing with zero competition. These mushrooms were exactly that. But that wasn't their only property. Bode stared at the fungi with a look of confusion. A second later, his expression shifted. "My body, it feels heavy." This was the window Will needed. He burned his remaining energy and closed the distance, rushing toward him at terrifying speeds. Bode smiled unfazed. He swung a fist, crackling with lightning, directly at him. Will coughed up blood and collapsed. "Idiot," Bode spat. He didn't even bother to glance down. "Obviously, I am superior in close-quarters combat, too. My unique magic controls electricity. If I reinforce my own body and move at boosted speeds, a little paralysis effect is nothing." Will lay sprawled on the dirt, thinking that even after all of that, he still couldn't pull off a win. "So this is your defeat," Bode said, stepping forward with his electrified fist raised. Suddenly a blade appeared, pointed right at him. Veronica stood behind Bode, sword in hand, her voice steady. "That's enough. You've taken this too far, Professor Bode." The professor let out a long, irritated sigh. "Veronica, you shouldn't be interfering. You're a new instructor and the match was already decided," she countered. "Dragging this out only hurts him. The kid can heal his own wounds. He can keep going, can he really?" Veronica didn't back down. "If he had mana to spare, sure. But he's completely drained. You're just wasting my fighting spirit." Veronica flared up her energy. Bode matched her stance. The two closed in. "Enough!" a voice boomed from above. Alnaram landed between them, hovering for a heartbeat before touching down. "Fighting each other here. That's pure nonsense," he said, locking eyes with Bode. "Cut it out." The director's gaze left no room for argument. Bode looked away. "Fine." Alnaram turned to Veronica. "I owe you an apology. I didn't explain the situation clearly enough." He cleared his throat and stood tall. "With that said, the main event of the training camp is officially over. Everyone is dismissed." Students began filing out of the Coliseum. Will tried to treat his own injuries right there, but cursed his lack of mana. His recovery was barely crawling, and he refused to just give up. Before he could push any further, Veronica scooped him up in her arms. He froze, stunned. "You did well," she murmured. "Don't push yourself any harder." Will was speechless for a moment, then nodded, playing her words over in his mind, trying to make himself believe them. It still wasn't good enough. As the night passed, he lay awake, overthinking. That was the caliber of a first-class offensive mage. It wasn't just raw power. The tactical depth was on a completely different level, refined in a way he could barely keep up with. And even with people like that, humanity had still fallen. He had to become stronger. In the morning, he knocked and asked to be let in. Finally, Alniram declared, "The wounds look as good as expected. As soon as my power returns, I'll heal fully, so participating in the training camp won't be an issue. You were the winner of the main event, so you'll be participating. Besides you, Sirius and Erica have also been selected." Will frowned. "But Professor Bode said everyone failed, and I didn't win." Alniram gave a half smile. "That happens every single year." Alniram explained that it was all a ruse. Every year telling everyone they had failed was a tactic to manufacture a sense of urgency in the students and push them to their absolute breaking point. In the end, most of them succeeded anyway. Will found it bizarre at first, but it made perfect sense the more he thought about it. In his past life, Bode was one of the heroes who fought on the front lines until the very end, defending humanity even, in a world he didn't agree with. That was just who he was, his own twisted way of being a great teacher. Alniram continued explaining that Will would be assigned as an offensive mage in a squad formed with students from other academies tasked with responding to monster subjugation requests. This would be the first time, since his regression, that Will would face real monsters. 5 years later, in his past life, monsters had been the direct cause of humanity's destruction. Originally, monster was just a term for any creature endowed with magical power, not necessarily hostile. Sometimes they attacked humans, but it was purely out of survival instinct or natural competition. Ecologically, they were just neighbors who weren't always aggressive. But in about 2 years, everything would change with the arrival of the Red Moon. Monsters would turn feral, start forming packs across species, and begin slaughtering humans, for no reason other than the bloodlust. 2 years after that, the Monster King would descend. Humanity was quickly outmatched, and nations crumbled. Offensive mages, the most valuable assets on the battlefield, died one after another for countless reasons. The knights were the same and even. The healers, who usually stayed far behind the front lines, were swallowed by the collapse. Will had lost his life. Barely any of the fighters made it out alive. In just a few short months, humanity would be standing on the absolute brink of extinction. He refused to let that nightmare happen again. He had to grow stronger than anyone from his past life had, to stockpile enough raw power to hold back those massive invasions, and if possible, uncover the true source of the Red Moon. Alniram shot Will a half smile. "You've got a lot of grit, kid. Same eyes as the day we met." He told Will he'd be just fine, noting that the teachers kept a close watch on the training grounds for a reason. There was something he wanted to tell him, in private. Will wasn't quite sure what he meant by that. Stepping outside, he found Erica and Veronica waiting for him. They were just chatting when Will noticed others approaching Sirius, and Professor Bode. Will mentioned he'd heard that Bode's brutal teaching style actually came from a place of genuine concern for his students. Bode marched up with a stone-cold glare. "I don't know what kind of nonsense you're spewing. You, the weaklings who can't even land a hit on me, have no right to get cocky." Will figured. The professor hadn't changed a bit. "If you finally get it," Bode continued, "then put in the work on the battlefield, Chatsy. Thanks for dealing with Sirius." "I'm grateful too," Sirius replied. Will turned to him, noting that he seemed much calmer than before. Sirius offered a guarded smile. "Thanks to you, I was able to focus entirely on my training and push myself to get even stronger. That's just how Professor Bode teaches. As long as you survive and get your payback, it isn't a defeat, it's a valuable lesson." Tweedledee chimed in. "Keep getting stronger." Sirius gave a genuine grin and bumped his fist against Will's before heading toward the carriage. Will mused that having more skilled offensive mages around was always a win, and he'd make sure that every single battle against the monsters swung in their favor. Veronica announced it was time to move out. Will was already settled inside the carriage when Veronica laid out the mission details. They were headed to the Dunkel Forest. This time the objective was to wipe out the goblin infestation in the woods. Each squad would consist of 3 students from different academies, Schwartz, Eilish, and Silburn, plus 1 teacher from one of the schools to provide backup. Erica asked if the squads were already set in stone. Veronica confirmed that she and Erica were in the same group. Erica figured that was better than getting stuck with total strangers, even if Veronica did make her feel a little uneasy. The professor mentioned that Will's squad was special, but they had arrived at the site. It was best to go meet the Silburn members already waiting. Will knew exactly who they were from his past life, but he'd never actually been introduced. Suddenly, a girl called his name, bolted toward him, and wrapped him in a hug, before he could even process what was happening. "I've been waiting for the day I could finally meet you." Will's face turned bright red instantly. "Wait a second. I have no idea who you are." The girl stepped back, not looking offended in the slightest. "That makes sense, we never properly introduced ourselves." She straightened up with a bright smile. "I'm Marie Goldgren, granddaughter of the Schwartz Academy director, Al Niram Goldgren." Will was completely stunned. He stood there frozen for a second, trying to process it all. So it was her, the girl he had protected back then. He never imagined they'd cross paths again. He asked how she was doing, and Marie beamed, saying she was doing great. She apologized for not thanking him properly back then, but Will brushed it off, saying it wasn't necessary. Her grandfather had recommended him to Schwartz as a favor, so they were even. Marie shook her head. She insisted on paying him back somehow. Lacking any real talent for magic, she joined Silburn and threw herself into swordsmanship. The result was that she climbed to the very top of the academy exams. "Turns out I've got a real knack for the blade." She giggled, saying it. Will mulled it over. 2 allies claiming top spots in the exams so quickly she had talent that was frankly absurd. Marie gripped his hands firmly. "You can count on me, Master Will. That's exactly why we were brought together. In the same squad." Will beamed, telling her they'd give it their all, and suddenly it clicked. He finally understood what the director meant by saying he was counting on him. Marie spun around abruptly. She mentioned that someone high-ranking had arrived, and they needed to go pay their respects. Erica remarked that their group seemed well-rounded, and Veronica agreed. The vibe was already spot on. Marie glanced around the room, searching for the other team members. She asked if Master Ren and Turf had shown up yet. Will froze at the name. The door swung open, and a man appeared asking everyone to hold their horses. They were heading out shortly. He paused outside and introduced himself as Master Ren's, wanting to confirm if they were indeed the students assigned to his team. Will felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest. It was his mentor from his previous life. This man had been his master and the greatest healer he'd ever known. He felt a secret surge of joy at being in the same group. Trailing behind Ren, a young, bookish-looking man appeared, grumbling that the professor still hadn't made his way down properly. Marie identified him as Master Turf and introduced herself. Turf offered a polite, "Nice to meet you," but his eyes darted straight to their joined hands. "And you are?" Turf asked, his tone barely masking his disdain. "Will de Schwartz offensive mage," he muttered, sounding annoyed. Ren stretched lazily, completely unbothered, and declared that this was their team. They could do whatever they liked. He'd just be watching. Marie frowned, questioning this lackadaisical attitude. Will thought to himself that this was exactly how his mentor had always been. He stepped toward Ren and asked if he could call him mentor. Ren raised an eyebrow, curious why. He explained that he knew how to use healing magic, but he'd never had a teacher for it and wanted to learn from him. Ren looked stunned. An offensive mage who could also heal. He muttered that he thought he'd heard whispers about something like that, and that the group's formation felt a little too intentional. When Will asked if everything was all right, Ren just shrugged. "Call me whatever you want." Marie immediately chirped that if Master Will was calling him that she would too. Turf tried to step in, but it was a lost cause. Erica and Veronica exchanged a look. The group was already getting way too chummy. Each team was assigned their own sector, with a cabin serving as their base of operations. The goblin territory was tucked a bit deeper into the woods. Usually in these scenarios, healers stayed behind the front lines. They were supposed to hang back at the base. Marie pointed out that Ren was a healer, but he kept walking anyway. Ren replied that he was the supervisor, so he was the exception. He'd do as he pleased, and he wouldn't be a burden. Marie promised to back him up so he wouldn't have to hold back. Will agreed, feeling like this moment meant something more. The goblins charged. Marie swung that massive blade with everything she had, cutting through the enemies. In wide, sweeping arcs, each strike hit with bone-shattering force. When she landed, a pile of goblins crumpled around her. Will watched her, thinking back to the girl lying in that bed, and the way she had ended up here. Marie's swordsmanship was just like that raw, unfiltered power behind every swing. Maybe she was the only one who could clear this whole place. "Big group incoming," she warned. Ren crossed his arms. "Impressive, but she leaves herself wide open, great for a frontal assault. But once she's surrounded, she's exposed. Cover her." Will nodded, realizing he was about to finally fight some real monsters. One goblin lunged straight for Marie. Will thought these goblins were truly formidable. "That tension in your shoulders," Ren noted. "Relax." Will was caught off guard, but he listened. It was just like before. Ren always noticed too much. So he fired up his magic circle, then layered on a physical enhancement and found his rhythm. He leaped into the fray, blade flashing, covering Marie's back without missing a single beat. "You can count on me," he said. Marie didn't hesitate for a second. "So this is what combat healing magic feels like. How are you holding up at a distance?" "Not bad." It would be celebrated internally. It worked perfectly against monsters, too. The blade that Professor Veronica had gifted him possessed a strength far superior to the standard lupus steel, cleaner and infinitely more precise. "You're really pushing the limits with that explosive power in the way you handle threats. Marie, it's honestly impressive." "That's enough for today," Ren announced, already walking away. "Let's move on to the next task." Marie mentioned feeling strangely lighter. Will noted that it was all thanks to their mentor. Ren's healing magic might have shown signs of severe strain, but his true specialty was sheer speed. It was so casual, so subtle, that no one around him even realized it had been cast. That's precisely why those who weren't healers never grasped just how extraordinary he really was. Will had asked him about it once. "I don't do this to show off," Ren had replied. "If you're healed, that's all that matters." Will didn't press the issue any further. But he knew the truth that the rest of the world remained blind to Ren was the greatest healer alive. Back at the team's cabin, Ren reviewed their progress. "Good work. You all performed brilliantly today. Everyone returned without a scratch, so I have nothing to report. Turf. Providing healing through a good meal is also a healer's duty," Ren replied, "and you nailed it." The incredible flavor was all thanks to that special sauce of yours. Marie couldn't stop raving about how amazing the professor was. He wasn't just a healer. He seemed to know the front lines better than anyone. When you're constantly patching up the wounded in the field, that kind of fundamental knowledge builds up, naturally, Ren explained. "That's exactly why the professor rarely shows up to regular classes," Turf added. "He's always out there. Isn't that dangerous?" Marie asked. "I have total confidence in my ability to run away," Ren replied. Will kept eating in silence. He thought to himself. He says that, but he'd never actually run away without saving everyone first. Losing his mentor would be a crushing blow to humanity, not just because he was a master healer, but because he was the only one who truly understood how to lead in battle. Fate might change for him and the others, but there was still time before that dark day arrived. Will looked down at his bowl and finished his soup. In this life, he wouldn't let his mentor die. The group spent the rest of the night enjoying each other's company. Deep in the forest, however, goblins gathered around a mysterious figure. Something was granting them the power of the red moon. The goblins began to turn savage. A massive mutated goblin lurched toward the group's location. The next day, they went back to clearing out the monsters. They swapped notes on the previous battle, and their teamwork felt noticeably sharper. At this rate, they would have been finished by the next day. They kept pushing forward until Ren suddenly froze. "Let's head back." "Why?" Marie asked, furrowing her brow. "It's only the 6th of February. We haven't encountered a single monster." "That's exactly the problem," the professor said. "There isn't a trace of anything out here. Goblins are fiercely territorial. When strangers get close, they usually swarm us, just like yesterday. We've trekked quite far and haven't found a single one. "What's going on?" Will demanded. "I'm not sure, but on the battlefield you have to trust your gut. And once we get back, we're calling in another squad to join us." "I trust Professor Veronica's team," Marie stated. "They have a base nearby and are well informed," Ren noted. "Let's get moving." Will hung back while the others started to pull away. This bizarre behavior from the goblins really stank of trouble. Marie shouted that they were getting close to the path leading to the neighboring base. Will tried to push the dread out of his mind. It reeked. Marie shouted that it was lurking right near the path to the nearby base. Will tried to push that thought out of his mind. Back in his former life, he knew he couldn't do it. But what appeared before him wiped away every other thought. Erica was right there, her hands bound by ropes, completely unconscious. Marie surged forward without a second's hesitation, shouting that she was going to save her. But suddenly the ground gave way beneath her. It was a trap. Instinctively, she drew her blade and drove it deep into the earth to catch herself before she could plunge. Hanging there, firmly, refusing to let go, she screamed at the others to watch out. It was a setup. They had used Erica as bait. Suddenly, more goblins shrieked, and a hail of arrows sliced through the air, straight toward their group. Will intercepted every single one with his knife before they could even get close. The goblins charged in right after, their eyes burning red, desperate for blood. Marie pulled herself out of the pit, while Will sized up the situation. They were swarmed by dozens of them. It was way too coordinated. Their movements reminded him of the Red Moon event. But that wasn't supposed to happen for another 2 years. Will felt his stomach twist into a knot. Was this nightmare already beginning? Erica groaned and shifted slightly. She was still alive. It wasn't the time to get distracted, but knowing she was breathing was enough to steady Will. "There's so many," Marie said. "At least dozens." "She's still alive." Will slammed his hand against the ground. "Leave this to me." Roots erupted around the group, weaving themselves into wooden guardians that walled off the goblins from every side. Will told Marie that she didn't need to stay on the front lines while the archers were picking them off from behind. It would be easier for her to find an opening. She could get into position. Marie planted her feet and unleashed everything in one go, shattering the enemy formation with a brutal strike. "What do you think of that?" she asked, looking satisfied. A goblin tried to blindside her from behind, but she swung around and struck the monster in the neck, before it could even touch her. "I'll cover the gaps. Great work, you two," Ren said. "I'm going to rescue the girl." "Go for it," Will replied. But something felt wrong. A heavy, sinking weight settled in his chest, even before he realized why the Red Moon was making these monsters act so violent. He already knew the reason. What he didn't expect was what was currently clawing its way out of the ground. An ogre it had been hiding beneath the earth, and the Red Moon was forcing different species to work together. Will realized he was too far away to help. It was exactly like his past life. Despite all his efforts to change things, he couldn't protect everyone at the same time. The ogre's massive fist swung toward Ren. Ren focused his magic, tapping into physical enhancement to dodge the blow at the very last millisecond. Will stood frozen for a moment. His mentor had actually mastered the offensive healing magic he'd taught him. The ogre spun around and lunged again. Ren dodged, leaped with all his might, and landed right behind the monster's head. "Good night," he muttered. Ren hit the ogre with a mental shock, knocking the creature unconscious instantly. It crashed to the ground with a deafening thud, while his mentor landed gracefully behind it. Will walked over and commented on the move he had just witnessed. Ren replied that a good mentor learns from his student, too. Will told him that was exactly what he expected from him, and Marie added that it was incredible. Ren started untying Erica and warned that they needed to get out while they still could. Will thought about it with the mentor's strength. He could probably take them all on. The wooden golems were still holding the line. Ren told him to stop being an idiot. He had only knocked the ogre out. He was a healer, and even if it was just a monster, he had no intention of killing the creature. Once the spell wore off, the ogre would be just fine. Will smiled, knowing that was exactly the kind of person he was. They sprinted away through the sewers. After taking out a few of the pursuers, the monsters seemed to give up the chase. Will signaled that they could finally catch their breath. Nearby, Ren channeled his healing magic, urging Erica to wake up. She slowly regained consciousness, dazed and disoriented, asking where she was. Marie assured her that she was safe. Will apologized for pressing her right after. She woke up, but he needed to know what had happened and why she had been left alone. Erica clutched her head, struggling to piece her thoughts together. She remembered the mission the day before had gone well, even if they hadn't managed, to wipe out all the targets. As the team regrouped, something went wrong. Professor Veronica had vanished. Will pressed for details, and Erica confirmed it. Veronica had left them a note telling them to wait because she would be back soon. But Erica grew anxious, and amidst an argument with the others, she eventually broke off to go after her. Will realized that this was exactly what the others must have warned her against, and she just hadn't been able to say no. There was nothing funny about this situation. One wrong move, and the girl could have lost her life. None of them were prepared to deal with that level of power gap. Erica said that as soon as she entered the forest, she smelled something sweet. The next thing she knew, she was here. Ren noted that the goblins must have used some kind of sleeping agent. The trap combined with them working alongside the ogre was strange, but there was no time to dwell on that now. Their base had to be nearby, and they needed to regroup with the others. On the way back, Erica suddenly asked them to stop. She stood frozen, staring ahead in shock. The base had been destroyed. Marie mentioned that she had already considered this. Goblins are extremely territorial and usually don't leave their own turf, so further out. They should have been safe, but now she needed to figure out why this was happening. Will mused that proactive attacks against humans were a trademark of monsters during the Red Moon, but there was no way to explain that for now. Ren noted there were no signs of a struggle, which meant the two of them must have fled somewhere. He was going to find them. Will Erica and Marie needed to head back to the territory and get out of the forest. The group agreed without question. Ren also warned them not to assume the base was safe and to stay on high alert. The group hurried back. Will asked if Turf was all right. The boy replied that dinner wasn't quite ready yet. Marie thanked him for being safe and sound, and Turf turned bright red. Will said he would explain everything later, but he had to leave, now. Then he turned and noticed something. He slowly clenched his fist. The ogre was standing in front of the house. They had tracked them down. Erica panicked, asking what they were going to do. Will said under his breath that he was just realizing how pathetic he had been until now. Erica didn't understand what he meant. Will replied that he was going to take that ogre down, and he believed they could win against a horde of that size. Teamwork would be everything. Marie shouldn't overexert herself like before. She just needed to land the right hits, leaving the front line to the wooden golem. Erica would have to hold the goblins back with her flames. The girl said with a bitter tone that someone like her had been captured so easily. Will told her that her flames were incredibly useful. Erica was surprised by the compliment and swallowed hard before taking action. She unleashed a burst of fire at the goblins. A wall of flame erupted in front of them, and the monsters hesitated, terrified by the heat. Erica cheered, relieved. It had worked, but Will noticed something was wrong. The ogre was pushing through the barrier unlike the goblins. This monster was on an entirely different level. Will ordered the wood golem to intervene and shouted at Erica to keep up the fire. She obeyed. The golem wrapped itself around the ogre and caught fire along with it. The beast let out a cry of pain. Will called out to Marie as he charged forward. She understood without needing a single word. She put every ounce of her strength into the strike and shoved the ogre back. The monster crashed into the ground with a massive thud. Marie, he called it a great team effort. Will agreed, but the relief was short-lived. The ogre hauled itself back up. The gashes on its gut were already knitting together. The flesh was regenerating right before their eyes. Marie asked if they should keep hitting it until the regeneration finally gave out. Will said no. There was no guarantee that would actually put it down for good. They needed a surefire way to end this. Before he could even think it through, Erica warned him that something was coming. Will snapped his knife up and blocked the impact. The ogre was hurling goblins like live projectiles. Will knocked the ones he could reach aside, muttering that they were just human, or rather goblin missiles. Pretty annoying ones at that. Erica warned that more were on the way. Marie swiped a goblin away with her blade, firmly stating she'd send them right back, and launched the monster straight back at it. Then she told Will that since he clearly had a plan, he should take care of the goblins. Will stepped forward, saying he was counting on them. The group split up. Erica and the wood golems held off the swarm of goblins. Using area of effect attacks, Marie handled whatever the ogre threw their way. Will charged straight at the ogre. The monster looked down and swung its claws in a low, sweeping arc. Will ducked, countering with a flurry of rapid strikes from his dagger. The ogre flew into an even deeper rage. It let out a deafening roar as the cuts began to seal up. Will vanished, reappearing behind the beast. He mentioned that while they were full of openings, that was exactly the point. He pressed his hand firmly against the back of the ogre's neck and triggered a life force overload. The monster's heart began to convulse, a sickening, agonizing sensation flooding its entire body. The ogre even shrieked in terror before exploding from the inside out. Will walked away from the remains with a smirk. It was simple logic. The ogre's regeneration worked just fine on superficial wounds, but the life force overload had shattered its body from the inside. Without a body left, there was nothing left to heal. He said that now only the goblins were left. That didn't take long at all. Will picked one off from the group. The head hit the ground and finally, it was all over. Marie declared it a total victory and pulled them both into a hug. The protagonist agreed, praising how well they'd coordinated. Erica still couldn't quite wrap her head around it, how they'd actually pulled it off. Will told them this wasn't the time to celebrate. The others were still in danger. Just then, a massive gust of wind tore through the forest. The protagonist recognized it instantly. It was serious. If he followed that tornado, he could regroup with the other teams. Sirius stood frozen after dumping all that power. Will assessed the situation and concluded he was all right. The protagonist let out a breath, relieved that everyone had made it out, unscathed. Boda then grabbed their attention. He wanted to know what that was, and where the instructor was, and the others. Rain appeared answering that they were right there. He ran toward the master, shouting that they'd found them, both of them. Rain replied that the tornado had been a huge help. It drew just enough attention to pin down their location. He said Will had done the right thing using it, and that he was glad nobody got hurt. Erica laughed. Boda noted that the mood was good, but someone was missing. Will confirmed it. Professor Veronica Boda said he wasn't worried about her, but he couldn't just leave without at least letting her know. Ren announced he would keep watching over the remaining students and asked if the other professor could handle the group while he headed off. The professor gave the green light. Sirius and Will set off to track down Veronica. Our hero tried to sharpen his hearing, pushing his senses to the limit. He needed to pinpoint any living soul nearby. But he hadn't trained enough to distinguish specific signatures yet. He'd have to do this the old-fashioned way. It didn't take long. He found Veronica. She looked fine, but something felt deeply off. She was clutching a red moon crystal in her hands. Then she whirled around. Will tensed up. It was that same ominous glow from before. The professor tucked the crystal into her pocket and demanded to know why he was tailing her. Will played dumb, insisting he'd just been looking for her. He claimed the monsters were acting erratic, and the training session had seemingly wrapped up. Veronica nodded, saying she understood and that they were heading back. Will begged her to wait. He had to know what that stone was. The professor brushed him off, saying it was nothing, but he pressed harder. He demanded to know what she'd been doing all this time, abandoning the rest of the students. He challenged her to give him an answer. Veronica parted her lips, apologizing, but she coldly noted that she wasn't one to share her methods, and he'd be wise to keep his mouth shut. Will sighed, feeling the weight of her aura. The professor told him not to worry, promising she wouldn't do anything reckless. He couldn't push it any further. He tried to dig deeper, but he just didn't have the strength to break through. And besides, he wasn't ready to suspect Professor Veronica. In his past life, she had been his comrade, and with that, the training camp came to an end. That night, he couldn't find a moment of peace. He couldn't stop wondering if Veronica was caught up in the Red Moon conspiracy. In his previous life, she had never acted like this, so he kept a watchful eye on her from a distance, eventually noticing her whispering with another professor. He cloaked his presence and crept closer. The other teacher mentioned he'd received a request to leave the campus and wanted to know where she was headed. Veronica brushed him off, claiming it was a personal matter. Will mused. Maybe she was about to make a move involving the red stone. He had no choice. He had to shadow her. Veronica navigated the city, and he stayed right on her heels. He knew he was acting on impulse. If he was wrong, he was just a creepy stalker. But he couldn't just shake this gnawing anxiety, not when there was a genuine chance to uncover the truth, before history repeated itself, and hopefully find a way to clear Veronica's name. He had to get to the bottom of it. It was the first time Will had returned to this city since his past life. Back then, after graduating from the elite academy, the monster outbreak had spiraled out of control, and he was dragged straight to the front lines, with zero time for anything else. At least, that's how he remembered it. Veronica paused in front of a stand and bought a bun from an elderly man. Will watched, and something stirred deep within him, the haunting memory of sharing that exact meal with her. Almost instinctively, he bought one too and took a bite. It was actually delicious. Veronica smiled, remarking that this spot was incredible. Will lied, saying he was from out of town and had never tried street food like this before. He asked if she did this often because she grew up in a merchant family. She confirmed it, but explained it was deeper than that. With everything that could go wrong in their world, she'd made a rule for herself. Every time she spotted a bakery, she went in. It started with trips with her parents, when she was just a child, and continued into adulthood through the grueling campaigns on the battlefield. She'd crossed paths with so many souls. Most of them she never saw again. And even when she did run into someone she once knew, they had changed so much they were practically strangers. She didn't want to live with any regrets. So she had finally let go of the habit of putting things off. Willard always said that was her strength. It's why she got along with everyone so well. Back in the present, he pressed the hand against his chest. Deep down, he knew he'd let Veronica die before, but this time things were going to be different. To change that fate, he had to see the truth for himself. Veronica ducked into a narrow alleyway, and Will trailed behind, keeping a safe distance. He realized he was being too obvious, so he tightened his focus and shrouded his presence even further. At the end of the alley, Veronica stopped to meet someone. The figure spoke, saying they'd been waiting for her, and apologized for the gloomy spot, but it was a matter of high importance. Then the stranger lowered their hood and said it was time to talk about the deal they had struck. Veronica pulled the stone from her pocket and handed it over. The man took it in both hands and froze for a heartbeat before erupting into barely contained excitement. He raved that it was absolutely extraordinary, claiming she had such remarkable talent, just as he'd always believed. Finally, the church's long-held wish was within reach. He'd bring the red moon even closer. Will felt the crushing weight of those words. So that was it. Everything was connected. The red moon, the stone, the church. But his focus slipped, and his shroud began to flicker. Veronica caught it instantly and whirled around her blade, already drawn. Will barely had time to react. He could only shout her name. Veronica snapped that he'd been following her. She stood rigid, her stance closed off. The man behind her remarked with calculated disappointment that he'd asked her to come alone. He said he was sorry she'd broken because he truly believed she would make a fine new recruit for the order. Veronica shot back, cold and firm, that he should just call this an accident. The man shrugged, saying that was fine. He'd let her handle it, and the order would always welcome her. Will waited, heart her answer. Veronica refused, stating she was only there to investigate, and she had no intention of sacrificing a student. Will chimed in, saying he was sorry for barging in, but he needed to understand what was really happening. Veronica sighed, admitting it was her own fault. She should have been up front sooner. That day in the forest, she'd felt something ominous. What she had uncovered was a monster in a state of blind, bloodthirsty madness, and nearby a red stone. Veronica described the chilling sensation she felt when she held it, as she channeled her magic into the gem. It had flared with a blinding, intense red light. That was when the man had approached, noting that stumbling upon someone with that kind of raw potential in a place like that had to be the work of a higher power. He wanted to prove the mission was worth it, but Veronica demanded to know who but there were rules to follow. If she wanted to unlock the secrets of the stone, she had to meet 2 conditions. Keep the stone glowing bright as proof of her qualifications, and tell absolutely no one about where he would lead her. He said he hated putting her through such a trial, but he really hoped to see her join their ranks. That was why Veronica had come here tonight, to investigate. She figured it was better to understand the danger than to let something catastrophic happen, without knowing the cause. Will argued that the story still didn't add up. Veronica apologized, but Will let out a breath of relief. It was clear enough that she wasn't the bad guy here. The man sighed, saying her feigned interest in the order was a lie. He tossed the stone aside, noting that it wasn't his style to turn away someone with such gifts. The man sighed, admitting that his interest in the order was a total lie, and honestly, that made him feel pathetic. He tossed the stone aside, remarking that it wasn't in his nature to cast aside someone with such raw talent. Will recognized that stone mid-air. It was the same one Veronica had found near the water, but before anyone could even react, the object began to glow. Suddenly, the surrounding monsters went into a frenzy, and 8 dragons surged out from the depths. The man watched in total awe. He remarked that even among the Order, those capable of awakening such immense power were incredibly rare. These dragons were exceptionally powerful. Veronica counted 8 of them. Will offered to handle half, but she shut him down before he could even finish his sentence. It wouldn't be necessary. Veronica unleashed her sword magic, slicing all 8 heads off in one clean strike. Will muttered that it was exactly what he expected from her, but the professor didn't let her guard down. She kept her eyes locked on the dragons as their heads hit the ground. Then they moved. Will asked if he was seeing things, and Veronica confirmed it. The dragons were still alive. She was desperate to figure out what kind of regeneration could keep them alive, even without their heads. There was no healing magic involved, which meant something was deeply wrong here. Suddenly, one of the dragons lunged straight at Will. He dodged, whipped out his knife, and slashed into the creature's body. He already knew how tough that hide was. Will grabbed the dragon and said he needed to test a theory. He'd take this one on. Veronica said she understood, but warned him not to push himself too hard. Will promised it would be over in a flash. He released the physical limiters on his body and launched himself forward with every ounce of his strength. He grabbed the dragon's head with both hands and pulled with everything he had. But what came off wasn't a head, it was a tentacle. It was a kraken. Veronica realized the truth immediately. It wasn't regenerating. It had never been a head in the first place. It was an octo-dragon, a soft-bodied beast, a deceptive trap. The monster spoke up. It mocked Will, saying he had finally figured out its true form. It happened in an instant, impressive. The Order hadn't assessed his combat ability, so they couldn't take him out at that stage. Doing so would have gone against their own interests anyway. It introduced itself as Al Ruth, and vowed to take both of them down with his own hands. Will looked at Veronica and asked if she could handle the monster. Her sword magic would likely be far more effective against this type of creature than anything he could do. Veronica said she would follow his lead, but she couldn't let a student stay in harm's way. Will grabbed her hand. He activated his physical enhancement and promised he'd be back after clearing the path. She just needed to stay safe until then. Veronica smiled, calling him a reckless student. Then she turned, telling him, "Fine, but watch out for one thing. This man probably had something else hidden up his sleeve." Will was surprised. She added that he had already proven that what they were facing wasn't impossible. He charged ahead. Al Ruth noticed how fast he was, then tapped his own chest, claiming he was just as quick. Will lunged with his knife, but the mage blocked it with his staff. Will hadn't expected that. Al Ruth chuckled, saying Will seemed talented at everything. Both of them pulled back to reset for the duel. The mage noticed he had a small cut on his face. It stung, but he could heal it. Veronica watched from afar, explaining that the red stone was emitting a passive flow of mana, which mimicked offensive magic. In other words, Al Ruth was a healer who knew how to fight. Will asked how he even knew the combat methods for healing magic. Al Ruth replied, "Well, of course I didn't. But by watching someone like Will in action, he was able to learn almost as if Will himself were his teacher." Will wondered if this had once been a legitimate combat style for healers. He needed to know how deeply these people had meddled. Al Ruth declared that at this stage, it was obvious Will had been a prodigy from the jump, and Al Ruth was burning with envy. He confessed he'd kill to meet whoever taught Will, then asked if Will had any interest in joining them. Joining the order, Will scoffed, telling him he must be joking. He'd never sink so low as to join that trash, not even in his next life. The healing magic in his hands flared with a crimson hue. Al Ruth's eyes widened. "What a waste," the mage muttered, stalking toward Will, vowing to end him right then and there. Will parried with his dagger, stunned by the sheer force of Al Ruth's physical enhancements. The order, the red stone, that fusion of healing and offensive magic. There were still so many secrets here, things he couldn't grasp just yet, but he would squeeze every answer out of this guy. And maybe, just maybe, he could rewrite this tragic fate. He deflected Al Ruth's staff, spun with the momentum, and shoved the mage back. Al Ruth steadied himself on his staff, admitting that, at this rate, he might actually lose. But he grinned, boasting about the power of the order backing him. He triggered something, a bodily corruption. One of his eyes shifted, glowing like a fox's. His arm began to warp and twist into a monstrous shape. "Absolutely gorgeous," Al Ruth whispered. "Beautiful." Will knew this was leagues beyond any standard physical enhancement boosted by healing magic. He demanded to know who taught him this. The mage laughed, saying it all came from the teachings of the order. Before that, his life had been a gray, endless slog. Just a healer, hired by magical units, dancing to the whims of arrogant fools. Every day, just a repeat of the last. But as a healer, he knew how to look closely, and what he saw was a world overflowing with people who didn't deserve to be saved. The order gave him the power and the awakening he craved. And finally, Al Ruth's life started to shine. Will growled that he had no clue what Al Ruth thought he'd achieved, but what he was doing was pure evil. If he keeps going down this path, countless lives will be thrown away. Al Ruth pounded his own distorted muscle, insisting it was all part of the plan. The order said it was meant to be. He blasted Will through the alleyway. Will slammed into the wall, spitting blood. Al Ruth strutted toward him, declaring that justice always wins. Will glared, thinking about the hollow shell of a man standing before him. Because of him, his little brother, his teacher Veronica, and so many others had lost their lives. Al Ruth froze, stunned. How was Will still standing after taking such a brutal beating? But there was a shift in his aura. Will began to mend his own arm. The wound sealed up almost instantly. Al Ruth couldn't believe his eyes. Every injury was gone. In mere seconds. What kind of recovery was that? Will spat that he would never forgive him, and he was going to make him suffer. Something far worse than death. Al Ruth lunged, determined to snuff out Will's life before he could heal again. Will moved at the exact same moment, slamming a fist into that monstrous arm, putting everything he had into the strike. Al Ruth was sent reeling. Will snapped at him not to start crying yet, because he wasn't even close to being done. Al Ruth barely registered Will's speed when an uppercut connected, landing square on his jaw. He went flying backward. He slammed into the ceiling of the alley before dropping to the ground, dead to the world. Will stared at the slumped body. He'd deal with him later. He turned his attention to Professor Veronica, who was still locked in battle with the Kraken. She focused, delivering a massive, flash magic-infused strike. The beast was sliced in 2 chunks, falling like slabs of sushi. Veronica glanced over, noting that Will seemed to be finished too. The monster's regeneration was incredibly potent, so it took some time to finish it off. Will acknowledged that the Kraken had been a hell of a fight, but he immediately whirled around and slammed his fist into Al Ruth's face. He shoved the guy against the wall, pressed the blade to the mage's throat, and told him it was time to start answering some questions. Al Ruth just laughed, asking Will not to make such a terrifying face. Will shot back that he'd decide what kind of face he wanted to make. He demanded to know exactly what this cult was, and what they were plotting. Al Ruth declared that a true believer never leaks secrets to outsiders. Then he jammed his own dagger right into his throat and shouted that he would dedicate his life to the cult. He cheered for the order to last forever and took his own life. Will just watched, mourning the fact that the fanatic had sacrificed himself just to protect the cult's secrets. He really was the perfect follower. In his mind, his soul would be guided straight to the realm of Lord Claudius's desires. But then Al Ruth's mind started to clear. He realized the wound was gone. Al Ruth muttered in confusion. He was certain he'd sliced his own windpipe. The agony from the cold blade had felt so real. Will explained that he'd been just as surprised when Al Ruth pulled that stunt. He had totally underestimated the guy's fanaticism, but he'd managed to heal him just in time. Al Ruth gasped that it was impossible. He was supposed to be dead. Will replied that he could heal him anyway. Al Ruth insisted that it was impossible for any ordinary healer to do that. Will told him he wasn't ordinary, and that in the future, he was going to be the greatest healer the world had ever seen. Then he let the threat hang in the air. If he could save someone on the brink of death, he could just as easily tear someone apart and put them back together as many times as he felt like. Al Ruth realized exactly what that meant and turned pale with terror. Will asked if he was ready to talk now. Al Ruth figured he didn't have a choice, but before a word could leave his lips, something seized his mind. A voice commanded him to die. Panic washed over Al Ruth's face. He collapsed to the floor, sobbing, as he lost all control over his own body. Will scrambled back in shock. The man was dying right in front of him. Veronica screamed for him to get out of there. Something was terribly wrong. Will obeyed. Al Ruth's body started to dissolve into black smoke. The two of them covered their faces as his remains rotted away into nothingness on the ground. Will rushed back to what was left, desperately trying to heal him, telling him to hold on, but it was all for nothing. Every ounce of Al Ruth's life force had been snuffed out in a heartbeat. It was some kind of brutal curse far too powerful to reverse. Will muttered to himself, wondering who was really pulling the strings of this cult. Veronica asked if he was all right. Will confirmed he was, but grumbled that they had just lost their only lead on getting any real information, and it was all his fault. Veronica told him the important thing was that he was still alive, and it was time to head back to the academy. On the walk back, Will mentioned that the red stone had been destroyed out of nowhere. Veronica agreed that the cult and that red stone were far too dangerous to mess with. Even knowing they existed was unsettling, and they had to stay on high alert. He agreed. He felt like, compared to his previous life, he was actually making some real progress, but he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever be enough. Veronica told him that in the end, she was just glad that he'd come along on this field trip. She had pressured the director into it, and it was actually thanks to Will that she'd noticed something unusual. Will finally understood. Veronica had only really noticed his existence in this current life. He took the chance to ask her why she kept using mana for combat, even though she was supposed to be a healer. Veronica explained that she came from a merchant family and had always had plenty of chances to interact with both healers and offensive mages. Maybe that was why. Will thought that if it were that simple, research into mana would be miles ahead of where it was now. Veronica admitted she couldn't quite explain it. It was like someone had told her something, back when she was just a child, a faint memory that was hard to pin down. Will couldn't help but wonder if that person had a connection to the cult. Veronica quickly shifted gears, asking if he wanted to grab a bite to eat. Will was stunned for a second, but he ended up saying yes. Even with so many loose ends and mysteries, Will had finally managed to find a lead that could steer him away from the doom he knew was coming. Of course, he didn't get off scot-free. He was punished for sneaking off into a restricted area of the noble estate without permission. A man was found dead in an instant. There was a clear vampire bite mark right on his neck. A voice echoed asking if he was truly dead, and claimed that now it was time to come and collect her. The woman let out a weary sigh, saying she would do it, but only because it was a direct order from the cult.